I love weird history. It's kind of what I do here. So when I learned about the 4-year war between chimp factions as studied by Jane Goodall in Gombe National Park in Tanzania in the 70s, I knew I wanted to cover it. It is a bizarre and unique moment in recorded history that she believes tells us as much about ourselves than it does about the chimpanzees. Very cool. But as shocked as you may be, it's real. This story I'm about to tell you really happened. Dr. Goodall was brilliant, and these stories we have from the perspective of chimps would be impossible without her. Before her studies, it was popular to name chimps by number. It was easier to run tests in labs on them under the idea that they were just numbers, no personalities, and no individuality. It wasn't until her that they got their names. Her human and empathetic approach to covering these animals is what opens the door to understanding them, why they exhibit certain behaviors, and what, if any, their motivations could be behind their decisions. She got us closer than we have ever been to the species that shares 99% of our DNA. And during this story, you will often make comparisons to similar things that we do as humans. So, rest in peace to the goat. And if you are interested in any of her causes, I have linked nonprofits below that she had some part in running that all fight for great causes. She also intentionally named every single member of the same family with the same starting letter. So, Flo goes to Fifi, who goes to Freud, as a way to track these lineages over generations. You can hear Freud and know the exact line of mothers that he comes from immediately, and that's really cool. This whole thing starts in 1960, when Dr. Goodall was 26 and sent to Gombe to observe chimpanzees in the wild. She arrived by boat down Lake Tanganyika in Tanzania, where she lived in a tent for many months and began her studies that would carry her more than 30 years. But it wasn't easy. She first, in order to get close enough to observe, had to gain the trust of the foreign animals. The very first chimp to grant her this much-needed trust was named David Graybeard, who had a gray beard. He was her entry into this world, and as she describes, she became such good friends with David that she could look directly into his eyes and see his soul. She would go on to witness him use tools, eat meat, and introduce her to the leading faction in this conflict, the Kasakela chimps. From then on, the doors to this unknown world swung wide open, and the insight from her studies has shown us just how similar we are to this species. For 50 years, she studied these chimps, and for 4 of those years, she looked on as they waged war against each other. It's exciting, violent, and surprisingly political. Here is what happened. It's a humid and rainy day out in the jungles of Tanzania. It is also silent. The usual howls and caws of wildlife have taken a break, and all you're left with is the beauty of the environment. Something you can easily forget about with constant stimulation by the animals that seemingly never rest. But for this exact moment, it is completely unbroken. Until apes come barreling through the branches of the thick jungle. 6. They're going too fast for you to count. And just as soon as they rocketed into your view, they're again out of sight. The jungle starts to return to silence. Only this is not what you want, so you spring up with your photographer and dart directly into the jungle, hunting the very thing that broke your peace. During your run, cries of a chimp ring out across the atmosphere. You're missing something. You go faster, no clue what you're about to find, until you break into a jungle opening, where the rays of sun beat down on a gruesome scene. You stand in shock as the chimps you have grown to love as if they are your own family circle and beat a poor chimp to death. Kicking, slamming, and dragging the chimp, he was outnumbered 5-1, and never stood a chance. You're supposed to be used to this, but this time, it's different. This was malicious, and most importantly, very intentional. This chimp had been sought out and slaughtered. Figgin, who you've seen grow up from a curious little ape with a knack for independence into potentially the most dominant leader the Kasakela chimps have ever seen, towers over his victim. It had been a long and difficult path to the top for this ape, but one that has hardened him and built him for this exact moment. Horrified, you have no clue that what you just witnessed is only the beginning of a long saga that had been building since the study began 15 years prior. But let's go back to then. There's a lot that happened in those 15 years that set the stage for the Gombe Chimpanzee War. Before we go back to the beginning and explain the context and the key figures of the war, I want to say that this is not the same as my usual history video. Typically, I have mountains of primary accounts, usually given by the very figures that were involved in these events. But here we are covering events by literal chimpanzees as documented by a team of scientists. Their intention can only be inferred through their behaviors and patterns since they never wrote it down, obviously. Still, this saga is incredibly interesting and it will not disappoint. If I make a claim about why they do/did something, it will be based on what Goodall's team concluded, not my own speculation. That out of the way, let's meet the Kasakela chimps of Gombe, Tanzania. After being led into the clan by David Greybeard, Dr. Goodall slowly started to meet and name the different chimps as she encountered them, which for me serves as a great way to introduce them to you. The first one outside of David that she would meet is the first alpha Jane ever documented, Goliath. The largest and most dominant figure of the whole Kasakela clan, he had his choice of the routes the group would take, when they would take them, when they would feed, and for the men, when they would patrol. We don't know when he came to power or how long he's held it, but it's clear to her that he's still in his physical prime. Unstoppable. Out of the full succession of power in Gombe that is recorded, Goliath is the first. And once he accepted Dr. Goodall, she was officially accepted into the Kasakela and able to conduct research. Another one that she would meet pretty early on would become one of the most powerful female chimps in the entire clan, Flo. Flo first appeared in her camp in 1962. She gained notoriety for being one of the first female chimps that was studied by Jane, and because of this, her lineage, one that by sheer coincidence would end up being a dynasty of the most powerful chimps with decades of control in Gombe, it had all been preserved and tracked. Flo was easygoing, which led to offspring that, once they survived to adulthood, were primed for independence and survival. She gave birth to 5 known offspring, Fabian the oldest, Figgin, Fifi, and later, Flint and Flame. Her offspring were socialized with humans from their birth alongside Jane Goodall's entry to the clan, so the chimps were very comfortable with the presence of researchers throughout their entire lives. Flo's children also became incredibly social within their own community. All of them, or at least the ones that survived into adulthood, reached a high rank in their society. Fifi, who would have 7 kids that would all live into adulthood, would also see 2 of her own offspring ascend to the top of the clan as the alpha. Dr. Goodall would begin her observations with Goliath as the alpha. This, like most things, would not last. And due to her proximity, she would be able to observe an ape falling out of power firsthand. Would it be grandiose? Dramatic? Would the clan split in half and families battle for who would ascend to the throne? Nope. At least, not in this case. Goliath's downfall would be relatively tame. He slowed as he aged, and naturally was unable to hold on to his position. His successor, the younger and now stronger Mike, would just start yielding the feeding times to himself. He would make other plays to Goliath's position, all plays that cleverly diminished his respect. Goliath, instead of clinging to power, would actually just let Mike do this. He knew that he was weaker and the tides were switching, so he quickly and quietly surrendered. This move kept Goliath from being violently disposed of, so probably in his best interest. What makes Mike unique, and what will come into play later, is his ingenuity. In his displays, he would be documented using human objects to help him intimidate his victims, specifically large tin cans that were left behind by the researchers. He was the first ape ever seen doing this, and it gave him a tremendous advantage. For those who don't know, a display is when a chimp threatens violence through intimidation, and the more confidently one can pull off an intimidating display, the better chance they have of winning a fight before it even starts, which is beneficial for both chimps involved because it can prevent serious injury to both parties. Mike never had the physical dominance, and this would prove an issue later in his tenure as alpha, but here, it's his ingenuity and ability to feign strength through his confident displays that gives him the throne now, when he wants it. Mike would go on to enjoy the spoils of leadership for many years leading up to the war, but he isn't the chimp in charge when it breaks out. Second-born son of Flo, Figgin, was intelligent. So intelligent, in fact, that even after studying hundreds of chimps in her lifetime, Dr. Goodall often referred to him as the smartest one she ever observed. His ability, even as a young chimp, to learn and adapt to his environment was remarkable. His other superpower was that he also had a very confident display. Even in adolescence, he was described as using his brains in his displays. He was always there in learning. When Mike used human objects in his displays, which were also incredibly effective, he was learning from that dominant male, a trait that a lot of young apes in a group possess. However, with Figgin, it was different. He had a drive for power very early on in his life, and was observed alone with human objects such as cans, practicing his own display. He only did this when he was completely alone, so as to not alert other males. This was unique, and it showed that even as a young chimp, he was preparing. When he was young and trying to make a name for himself in the clan, he was quick to notice if one of the adult males had an injury or an illness, and he would use those moments to display dominance over them, charging at them over and over again. While it was rare, sometimes he would actually win over the older and stronger males. And while these victories were always temporary, since the beaten males would usually just heal back after time, these small victories would serve to grow his self-confidence. All of this shows that he was highly motivated from a very young age for power. And with his motivation, he was almost certain for future alpha, except he had a flaw. His Achilles heel was that he was rash and very high-strung. He would blow up and lose his cool at a moment's notice. In moments of social excitement, he would occasionally scream and run towards a family member for comfort, usually his mom Flo. This inability to control his emotions would lead to a lot of altercations, but none that he was not well prepared for. To rise to power, he still had 3 individuals in his way that he'd have to take care of first. First, his older brother Fabian, who had the natural advantage as the elder in the family. Then, Everett, his childhood playmate, and Humphrey, the biggest and by far the most aggressive of the big 3, before he can face the final boss, the alpha, Mike. Luckily, he already had been building his confidence, so now all he needed was timing. Turns out, waiting was the perfect first step. His older brother got struck with polio via an epidemic that swept Gombe in 1966, and as a result, he lost the use of his right arm. This was his opportunity. He would make quick work and dominate his older brother. He had now achieved the goal of the most dominant male in his family, and now it was time to continue with this work. After beating his brother, Fabian and Figan grew distant for years. If it weren't for their mutual love for their mother, Flo, they probably would have never seen each other again. Especially because Fabian would grow closer with Humphrey, who was one of Figan's primary targets. It didn't matter. Figan was set on achieving ultimate power regardless of who he had at his side. For 3 years, Figan waited, as he knew he was not yet ready to attack Humphrey. Instead, he started charging at his old friend Everett, and Everett back at him. Everett was slightly older and came off slightly better every single time. Without even being able to beat Everett, he was completely stagnant. Figan's rise was almost cut completely short. After all this time, he was only able to successfully beat his older brother, who was already injured. He was not big or aggressive enough to defeat these chimps without an ally, but waiting would come to his benefit yet again, when he would again attack Everett, but this time he didn't do it alone. Much to the shock of the researchers, during the moments of the attack on Everett, Fabian jumped in to help his brother. The two, now as a team, were able to make quick work of the older chimp, and injured him quite badly. Target number 2 had been defeated, but it wouldn't last long. Everett knew Fabian wouldn't always be around to help, and Fabian still maintained his friendship with Figan's third target, Humphrey. However, Mike too was beginning to grow weak, much like his predecessor Goliath. He had been in his alpha position for years now and slowly aging out of his prime. Unshockingly, Figan was the first to notice this. He was the first ape of the Kasakela to decide to challenge him. As a result, Mike starts charging at Figan regularly, as almost an attempt to gain back his respect. But it was too late for that. Figan simply ignored these charges, coming off as indifferent, and this just made Mike look even weaker to the rest of the clan, and it didn't take long until the other males started to take notice too. Everett, Humphrey, and Fabian all began to see the cracks, and the researchers knew it wasn't going to be long until one of them struck to claim power. Humphrey, the most aggressive of the bunch, would be the one to do it. In January of 1970, he would attack. Followed by his friend Fabian, they would attack Mike, and it would be a quick fight. They slammed down again and again on his chest, and as Mike retreated up a tree for safety, Humphrey grabbed his leg and threw him back down to the ground. Fabian would beat down on his chest once more, and just as quickly as the attack began, it ended. Humphrey had done it, and beat Figan to the throne in the process. Mike's 6-year reign had ended, and overnight he went from the alpha to one of the lowest ranking males in the Kasakela. Humphrey's reign would not be nearly as long or impressive. He was not nearly as intelligent as Mike or Goliath, and he lacked the allies needed to maintain power. He had not dominated any other males and had no loyal soldiers. Instead, he was described as a bully. Hugh and Charlie, 2 of the other high-ranking males in the community, left south weeks before Humphrey's attack, which left him a quick walk to Alpha, but a weightless one. Immediately, he knew that Figan was going to be his biggest obstacle at maintaining leadership. Whenever the two were together, he would display against him, which Figan usually brushed off time and time again. For a year and a half, Humphrey maintained leadership. Figan was preoccupied. He had yet really beat Everett on his own, and before he made a play for Alpha, he'd have to deal with this first. Shortly after the change in leaders, Everett got his revenge for the attack from Fabian and Figgin. With the help of an older male, the two would find Figgin in a treetop and attack him. The attack was so brutal he would fall 30 feet to the jungle bed below. Thud! He laid there on the jungle bed, crying out alone. It wasn't long until Flo, who was now elderly, emerged out from the jungle to take care of her son. Just like that, her presence was able to calm him. After a quiet moment together, he would get up and follow her. He would be lame for 3 weeks, for which he stayed with his mother throughout its entirety. Just like when they were young, Flo would let them explore and play, but the moment she was needed, she was there. He would eventually regain his health, and now was ready to reattempt his hunt for Alpha, except he didn't attack Everett again. He went for Humphrey, who he had never yet attacked. At least it's now mentioned in the documents. He would find Humphrey while feeding, with the full clan onlooking. The battle itself is not what makes this encounter notable. It's what happened during and after. They both went around the group and attempted to touch each of the onlookers. They weren't fighting. They were competing to assemble allies. Figgin was the one who did this successfully, getting 2 of the other adult males to join in with him, and the 3 charged at the Alpha. In fear, Humphrey cowered and fled into the thick jungle, defeated. For days, Humphrey walked through exile in the jungle alone. Humphrey's short reign had now come to an end. Figgin's, however, had not yet begun. He had unseated the Alpha with the help of 2 other adults, but he had not yet established dominance. The Caciquelas now had no Alpha at all, and instead a power vacuum as the researchers waited for someone to fill it. And without a solid ally willing to consistently fight for him, Figgin had no way of seizing it. Humphrey would soon return and strike up an alliance with Everett. Together, they would ignore Figgin's displays without risk of being attacked. This increased tensions between Everett and Figgin, who already were incredibly tense around each other to begin with. Figgin needed Fabian. While never joining in on attacks against his younger brother, he would also not join in to help fight with him either. At least, not until late 1972, when Flo would die. Her body was never found by the 2 apes. She merely wandered off one afternoon, never to be seen again. Despite this, once it became clear to the 2 brothers that she was gone forever, their bond would become the strongest it had ever been. The brothers, after years of complex relations, were unified, and they would complete at long last Figgin's list. At the end of April 1973, the 2 would attack Everett together. He would retreat into a tree, whimpering, until a few hours later when he was able to escape as the 2 brothers were still waiting for him below. 4 days later, he would take his final step towards his goal. While all 4 key players were present, he stopped for a drink by a nearby river and heard Humphrey bristling about in the branches above. He then puffed his hair out to look double his size and charged up at Humphrey, an impressive display, and charged for dominance. Fabian didn't even have to join in. He just sat in his nest and waited to see what would happen. And he probably would have jumped in at a moment's notice, and Humphrey knew it. Figgin climbed up above him, jumped down to Humphrey's branch, and the 2 fell down to the jungle floor below. Whimpering, he laid there as Figgin returned to the tree. It would be hours until Humphrey would quietly return to his nest, just trying not to anger Figgin again. Then, for good measure, just to solidify his dominance, he would lastly attack Everett, and leave him with no room to escape this time. The Caciquela chimps of Gombe finally had a new leader. Figgin had done it. Okay, let's dial back the clock because there are other things going on as Figgin is rising that we need to talk about. Mike is still firmly in charge. Figgin is in his adolescence and practicing his display with the tin cans. Goliath, the aging titan, is struggling with his loss of power. He no longer has a say of when he feeds, when he mates, and where he can go. This is a problem. Luckily, Gombe National Park is huge, around 15 square miles. He decides to slowly start making his move. Goliath splinters. He needs more space and wants more resources all to himself. Fair enough. Lower-ranking males did this often, so what makes him any different? Now that he was just another lower-ranking male, why not? He begins traveling south for brief visits with some of the other lower-ranking males. Slowly, those visits become longer and longer. Mike's reign was not universally beloved, and Goliath did not want to be in the front seat for it. In the south, he discovers a small group of other chimps, and a lot more resources to go around, exactly what he was looking for. Unknowingly to him, this catalyst acts as the biggest moment in Gombe's history. Whether he likes it or not, Goliath was still the former alpha. His movements have weight. After making this move, many of the other older males decided it would be better for them too. And just like that, this process of lower-ranking males fleeing south has greatly accelerated. He was not the first, but he was the most important. Other lower-ranking males, like the chimps Hugh and Charlie, had already started their move south before Goliath, but now splintering had social approval from a former alpha, and the full territory of the Kasakela would now be split. Good for no one. The faction, while just a loose group of chimps that went south and were not yet fully independent, will eventually get the name the Kahama. This process evolves over years and goes on throughout all of Mike's reign. Since he had a good relationship with Goliath, they were able to be cordial, which kept the peace for the rest of the chimp population. Goliath kept the southern males from attacking, and Mike did it for the Kasakela. Together, peace was maintained through diplomacy. However, when Figgin comes to power, he has no need to respect relationships that didn't benefit his own dominance. By the time he takes control, Mike's fading power and Goliath aging even more means that the peace between factions was slowly fading too. With hostilities growing and the groups officially split, the Kahama officially gets their name. Chimps are no strangers to territory conflict. They are famously territorial, much like us, and in a place like Gombe, which was protected by the government, so they had the full freedom to dispute over their finite lands, it was a huge problem. The Kasakela would often patrol their outer territories to ensure no one was encroaching on their resources. In one instance, a group of 7, led by Figgin, was patrolling north and had ventured further into the Matumba community, the community of apes that bordered them to the north. They heard a crackling of branches. They would proceed to get very excited. It was a female chimp with her infant, most likely a part of the Matumba community. They all attacked and beat this poor chimp senseless for 15 minutes. She would attempt to escape and eventually succeed by getting into a tree, only followed by Goblin, an adolescent chimp who was practically Figgin's ward. He would continue the attack while the others displayed below. Now, with her infant, the Kasakela chimps would proceed to fling it around like it was a branch, killing the infant. They would leave, but the female was greatly injured. Now, chimps aren't humans. No one from Matumba is going to come down seeking revenge for their fallen mother or sister and kill the Kasakela. The poor ape was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. In these patrols, every so often, but especially if they came across a solitary female, would attack. This is the kind of violence chimps are capable of, even though the territory lines are loose and almost always overlap. If you were spotted alone by a patrol, you could very easily be part of a vicious attack. The 4-Year War was similar in its brutality, but differed in the facts that it was organized, intentional, and sought out. Tensions between the Kasakela and the Kahama chimps had been growing rapidly in the preceding years after Mike started declining in power. The Kasakela tended to avoid the southern subgroup as much as possible, which in a way was confirming their territory as legitimate, and therefore their identity as completely independent. Hugh and Charlie, 2 of the most fearless Kahama males, often ventured further north to feed, which was the Kasakela territory. This was no good, but despite this encroachment, Figgin and the other Kasakela still avoided them, maybe afraid of attacking, seeing as they were already fearless enough to head into their territory. On other occasions, Mike and another elder male, Rudolph, still snuck into the overlap zone to play with the other elder of the south, Goliath. So, even though tensions were at an all-time high, there was still an active attempt to not attack when possible. When other chimps of the communities encountered each other in the overlap zone, there were typically displays against each other, but not yet violence. This carried on for years, until, well, a group of Kasakela chimps snuck up silently on a Kahama male, Goody, and ambushed him when he least expected it. He didn't even hear them coming, and by the time he realized, it was too late for the ape. As the ambush closed in and attacked, he sprung down from a tree and fled, but before he could get away, Humphrey and Figgin, who had now become close friends, followed by another 3 males, chased him down. Humphrey got to poor Goody first, snatching him by the leg and hurling him to the ground. He would proceed to hold him there, prisoner, as the other chimps began a brutal assault of the Kahama male. Figgin stood over the male as the researchers looked on. After 10 minutes, they had finally stopped, and Humphrey let go of Goody, who was so gravely injured that he just laid there still. Kasakela were vicious, and they yelled and vanished back into the jungle, leaving Goody to die on the jungle floor. He was never seen again by the staff of Gombe and presumed dead. This was the first casualty in the Gombe Chimpanzee War. As the war carried on, there were 2 more Kahama casualties. The first one was D, who was also ambushed by the Kasakela, brutally attacked, left to die, much the same. It wasn't all perfect back in the Kasakela either. Not because the Kahama had unified against them, but during the war, 2 female chimps, Pom and her mother Passion, had begun committing infanticide on lower-ranking females. They would kill the infants to protect the food supply for their own offspring and secure that their bloodlines would have a higher chance of survival. Due to their high rank, they would always have the protection of the alpha and other alliances with strong males that they had built. This would be observed on multiple occasions. And while the mothers were spared, they would be seen drinking the blood of the infants, banging them against the jungle floor, and eating the babies right in front of the mothers. They did this on multiple occasions to the lower-ranking Gilka. By her third baby, she was so terrified of Passion and her daughter, she would seek protection with one of the other higher-ranking males. Since she had no children that grew to adulthood, she had no one in her family to protect her. So, she turned to a friend, Humphrey, to help. While he helped, he couldn't always be around, and after the third infant, she was done, and totally gave up. This, on top of the ongoing war, made these 4 years the darkest and the most violent at Gombe. And the war wasn't yet done. Goliath, the oldest of the Kahama, was alone in the woods when it happened to him next. The second chimp who ever let Jane Goodall in, and the first alpha of the Kasakela, was brutally attacked by ambush as well. As noticed by a researcher who was there for the attack, they were definitely trying to kill him. Apparently, they were spinning his leg, breaking it in multiple spots, as if they were trying to dismember him. Figgin charged and attacked the quivering body of his childhood hero. They were repeatedly beating on tree trunks and throwing rocks. They retreated into the jungle as they scream out chants and ooze of victory. Goliath, like the other two, was never seen again after that moment and was presumed dead. And just like that, the Kahama were down to a sole 3 adult males. Goliath was beloved, even among the members of the Kasakela. This shows how seriously Figgin and the Kasakela were taking their territory. Sometime later, a fisherman was out on the lake outside Gombe when he heard the sounds of a vicious attack coming from the Gombe range. Charlie had been the next killed. The attack wasn't seen by the researchers, but Charlie's dead body was found brutally mangled, including his testicles having been ripped off, which answered the mystery of what the fisherman had heard. With only 2 males left, the days of the Kahama were numbered. The next assault was one of the females, however. Madam B, awesome name, was next. An older female, she was attacked in the same way as the others. Figgin and his patrol kicked, pounded, and beat her to the brink of death. She was able to crawl away while the Kasakela displayed their chance of success. She would be forced to hide as quickly as possible, which she did. She found a spot completely hidden from the attackers. Didn't matter. 4 days later, she would die from the injuries from the attack. Now that even the females weren't safe, there was a possibility the Kasakela wouldn't stop until every defector was murdered. Then, Willy Wally, one of the final 2 Kahama males, was murdered, leaving Sniff the sole survivor of the Kahama males. But now, with the unfriendly Kasakela chimps to the north and the stranger chimps of the Kalande to the south, he was out of options for survival. He was young and intelligent, and for a year was able to survive from both sides. He would eventually be hunted down and murdered too. This now left the Great Kahama clan, once its own full clan, down to 2 mothers and their infants. They would eventually go missing, presumably killed in the same fashion. By 1978, 4 years after it began, the entire clan was completely annihilated. They were unable to perform the same unified attacks the Kasakela did, and therefore it was over before it even started. A complete massacre. This war changed the entire perspective on chimpanzees from the researchers. They were not previously aware that chimps were even capable of an organized conflict, and believed that this was uniquely human. After, it could no longer be denied. The Kasakela could finally access the entirety of their territory, and Figgin brought them back to the times of Goliath. They had gone from 12 to 15 square kilometers, and now could travel freely and safely. The war was over, but the conflict was not. The Kahama clan's positioning on the map ended up proving vital when the Kasakela began to encroach on the larger Kalande community south of the Kasakela. As the Kasakela moved south, the Kalande moved north. The Kalande had patrols of their own, and this forced the Kasakela to retreat north when needed, and move slowly and cautiously when south of their usual territory. This opened up the Kasakela to more violence than they had to deal with the Kahama. In one instance, a patrol attacked and injured Humphrey for being in their territory. He would later die from these injuries. The Kasakela's territory would then shrink again, and they would end up right back where they started. With the Matombe community to the north capitalizing on the Kasakela move south, they would encroach from the north, and by the end of 1881, the Kasakela were down to 5 square kilometers. Nice. By 1982, Figgin would be usurped and kicked out of power by his once ward Goblin, and thus the line of succession would continue. No alpha can stay alpha forever. And after Fabin's death, his brother and number 1 ally, it was impossible to hold on for much longer. Time would pass, and the memory of the Gombe Chimpanzee War would fade. Now, the Gombe National Park is still operational, and the Kasakela is still there. None of the names you would recognize, but some of the chips today were around to see the war. Sparrow, the oldest chimp in Gombe, was born in 1957, so she has seen everything from the beginning right alongside the researchers. That is the story of the Gombe Chimpanzee War. If you liked it, please subscribe.